Our nation's ability to bounce back from its low points is the main theme of my next guests as well. On the 20th anniversary of the seminal Bowling Alone, the collapse and revival of American community, political scientist and humanitarian Robert Putnam is back, along with co-author Shaylyn Romney Garrett, with a new book, The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. Let's all hope. Bob and Shaylyn, great to see you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Jim. Good to be back.
Thank you.
Bob, let me start with you. For a nation that has been looking for hope, you provide some. You start with a time that you say is not unlike now. Describe the commonalities between the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century and America today.
I will do that, Jim. I have to say that this book was off at the publishers before the virus, so we wrote it not knowing that the book was going to be published in the middle of what we're in now. We noticed the remarkable parallels between the plight of America at the end of the 19th century, at the Gilded Age, the last Gilded Age, and the plight of America now. Great great inequality, great polarization, great social isolation, great cultural narcissism. And that led us to think, well, maybe there are lessons we can learn from that period that would apply to this period. And at the time we were thinking of, when we said this period, we were thinking of the next, 10 years. Now we're thinking about the next 10 months or even 10 days, because we think some of these lessons apply right now.
Bob, was there a Trumpian figure in that time in America or no?
No, there really wasn't, Jim. And that's relevant to the broader story, too. As you know, when we describe this whole period, America's been going in this bad direction for the last 50 years. And Trump comes into this story, into the American history, very late in this process. The problem we're talking about, which is this extreme concatenation of inequality, polarization, social isolation, narcissism, and so on, begins long before Trump walked in the door of 1600. And it's not going to be fixed when he leaves 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's the larger picture. We got to work on it, not just because getting rid of him is just the very first step.
Shaylyn, let's stay with the chronology. So the late 1800s, after the late 1800s, the I, according to your I curve, becomes the we. What happened and why did it happen?
So the time of the Gilded Age really gave way to something known as the Progressive Era. And it was a moment when a very diverse group of reformers grabbed the reins of history and sort of righted the ship. So all of these negative trends that Bob has identified started moving in a positive direction. We started getting more equal, less polarized, more cohesive in our social fabric, and more focused on altruism. And that's what started to happen. And that's a trend that unfolded over the course of the ensuing 70 years.
Why did it happen, though?
We saw an intense moral awakening, actually, which is a surprising thing to focus on. But actually, when you look at the data and pair that data with the historical record, this seems to be the thing that turned first. There was a group of reformers who came along and said the social Darwinism of the day, the dog-eat-dog, survival of the fittest mindset, was producing a really negative situation. And along came a group called the Social Gospelers, who called on us to really look at our primary conceptions and think about how we could begin to change from the self-centeredness of the time into something that was more focused on the we.
Bob, I am embarrassed to admit that I was a history major who knows absolutely nothing about American history. In the spirit of candor. But I would say that progressive era, I would have said, left one important group of Americans out, people of color. Yeah. What would you say about how that period was for them?
Well, both Shaylyn and I agree with you completely. And in fact, we have a whole chapter in the book devoted to race and actually another chapter devoted to something else that was maybe left out then, which was gender. And it is certainly true that that the progressive movement was, many parts of it were racist, pure and simple. And when we describe the lessons of the progressive era, one of them is, boy, that's something to avoid. Don't be nearly so racist. So focused on white males. And that's, as we described in an op-ed in the New York Times over the weekend, that's an important part of the story. That is that there was just a lot of racism, and it persisted for a long time to today. But there's another part of the story that we also talk about that's a little more surprising. Most Americans, Jim, have a view of, if you look at history over this period, as if most black people, I'm going to talk specifically here about black people, although it applies across the board, most of the period where they were completely subjugated and without any possibility of equality. And then there's the flash of the civil rights movement and everything gets better. Sure. That is not true. That's not an accurate description of history. America was making progress toward racial equality in the first 2/3 of the 20th century, and we stopped making racial progress after 1970.
Well, Shaylyn, let's go to that period again. You seem to be our transition person here. We go from the we in that curve back to an I, essentially a second gilded age in the middle of the 20th century. What triggered that?
It's really hard to say exactly what triggered it. This was, again, Bob has used this phrase to describe the earlier period, but this was sort of a concatenation of crises. Everything from the assassinations to the Vietnam War to the gas crisis. But a big part of this story was actually white backlash to the civil rights movement. We saw, it wouldn't have been possible for the civil rights legislation to pass unless we were at this moment that was sort of a peak of national consensus around the idea of widening the we. But the minute we did that, there was actually a backlash amongst white Americans who realized suddenly they were going to have to give up some portion of the pie. And they sort of changed their minds about how enthusiastic they were about that. And that resulted in a sort of foot off the gas period for racial progress. Now, whether the broader turn from we to I caused the white backlash, or whether the white backlash caused the broader turn from we to I, we can't really say. But that's an important part of this story.
So, but Bob, the critical question for readers, I being one, is will history repeat itself again? Your subtitle is How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. What in 2020 America suggests to you that we have it in us, that a second progressive era awaits us if we do certain things?
First, Jim, I want to call attention to the fact that the expression there is how we can do it again, not necessarily how we will do it again.
Understood.
And we're not in the prediction business, but we are in the business of saying we have these possibilities. And so you go through the various lessons we learned from the first period. For example, the first progressive era was basically led by really young people. The progressives of the first movement were really young people. And then you talk about Greta Thunberg or the kids from the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, and that makes me really quite optimistic. That's what it will look like if we're moving into this new period. And you go through each of the lessons we draw from that period, and you can find examples now that I want to emphasize. We don't promise you a rose garden. We don't say it's going to happen. We say there's nothing determined. Agency is important to this story, Jim. We can escape from this supposed bounds of history. By that I mean people then thought maybe they would. I mean, many people thought they were condemned to be ever in this progressive era. Ever in the Gilded Age. But some people grabbed the reins of history and turned history. Really did, and that's true now. We want to say to young people today: don't be cynical. Don't think that you're condemned by the last 50 years to go forever downhill. You can make a difference because they did. I'm sorry, I'm in my sermon mode.
Your buddy here does not want to play Nostradamus, so I'm going to try with you if I can for a second. You know, when you watch John King on CNN on election night, you hope he's going to tell you what the markers are that you should look for to determine whether or not your candidate or your outcome is going to happen. What are the things viewers should be looking for in the next 10 months, 12 months, 2 years to suggest that history will repeat itself and we will return to another we, I guess, in a W rather than just a curve? What will we see?
We have to be looking for people who are courageous enough to put moral language around the problems that we are facing. And I think that Biden is starting to show us that he's willing to lead the way in that conversation. And there are others out there who are doing so. The Reverend William Barber is out doing moral marches on Washington, leading a new poor people's campaign, asking us to think about what we owe to each other, not what rights we have we can lay claim to. And I think another thing is really seeing people turn back toward the local, turning toward what they can begin to do right outside their doorstep, rather than looking to Washington to lay out some grand plan for how we're going to fix this. And the last thing I would just highlight is prioritizing relationship. The best way to combat disinformation, polarization, all of these negative trends is relationship. Can we begin to get back into conversation with one another and rebuild the missing social trust in that way? I think that we are looking for something that's happening at the grassroots rather than something that's happening on the national level. And a lot of those indicators don't make it up to the national news. And so I think look to your local news providers to tell you the stories of what's happening in your own community and think about how you can get involved there. When we start to see more of that, we will start to see another upswing.
And the only thing I'll add to that, Shaylyn, is no matter what you do, never bowl alone. Can we all agree on that, gentlemen and lady? I hope so.
Yes,
Bob
please.
Putnam, Shaylyn Romney Garrett. It's great to meet you, Shaylyn. Bob, it's great to see you. And the book is terrific. I recommend it to everyone. Be well, both of you.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
The book, again, it's terrific, is The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again.